You'll sleep in the basement tonight." Hannah said it like she was placing trash at the curb. No hesitation, no warmth. Just a command dropped into the air. The words clung to the kitchen like smoke. The smell of fried onions from dinner lingered, sharp and greasy. The refrigerator hummed, the furnace groaned. And I sat at the table, fingers wrapped around a chipped teacup trembling. The porcelain rattled against the saucer, a sound too loud in the silence. Mark, my only son, kept his eyes fixed on the floor. He stirred his coffee, though it was already cold. Not one word in my defense. Not even a glance. "I am 72. I buried my husband in this house. I raised Mark here with nights of sewing until dawn, my back bent, my eyes blurred. I paid off every brick and beam with calloused hands in years that vanished too fast. And now my reward. Banished to the basement like luggage too heavy to carry. Folks, tell me, what would you do if your family tried to erase you? Would you fight back? Or stay quiet? Comment below. I need to know which side you'd stand on." To the basement. Even the words scraped like gravel across my chest. I had never slept down there. It was where old boxes leaned against cement walls, where the smell of bleach and damp cardboard mixed into something sour. It was not a place for people. It was a place for things forgotten. I lifted my cup, tea gone lukewarm. My hand shook so hard a drop spilled, dark against the faded tablecloth. I pressed the fabric, remembering the years I had washed it after birthday parties, after Christmas mornings. Now the stains spread like a wound no one would clean. "Basement's got space," Hannah added. Her tone was neat, clipped. She did not even look at me. She looked past me like I was already invisible. Mark just nodded once, his jaw tight. Invisible. That's what I had become. Not a mother. Not a woman who gave her life away. Just another burden too loud to keep upstairs. My thoughts twisted. Goodness, was this the son I carried through fevers? The boy who clung to me at night after nightmares. Now he clung to her silence instead. I stared at the doorway leading down. Wooden stairs creaked with drafts. A chill floated up even as the furnace clicked on. Basement air felt like punishment before I even moved. I wanted to speak. To slam my cup down and shout, "This is my house. My name is on the deed." But my throat closed. Age does that. It strangles your voice when you need it most. Instead, my lips quivered and I whispered to myself, "Don't cry." Not in front of them. The tears burn hotter when you hold them back. My eyes blurred the yellow kitchen light, turning Hannah's smirk into a smear. Mark's silence became an empty chair. I sat alone, though we were 3. I remembered the last Christmas with my husband. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon. Snow fell thick outside, but the living room glowed warm. He kissed my cheek, whispered, "This place will always be yours, Helen." That memory struck like a match against my cold skin. His voice was still here, though he was gone. I placed the cup down carefully, aligning it with the crack in the table's surface. Something shifted inside me, quiet but solid. I was not trash. I was not luggage. And I would not be buried in the basement while breath remained in me. Still, I rose from the chair slowly, steadying my knees. "I'll see what I can arrange," I said softly, not to please her, not to surrender, but to buy silence for one more night. Because silence has a use, it gives you time. It hides your planning. I touched the stair rail, cold metal under my palm. I did not step down, not yet. Instead, I looked back at them. Hannah rinsed dishes, back turned. Mark scrolled his phone, face hollow in the glow. Neither looked at me. Invisible, but not gone. I walked to my bedroom instead, shutting the door with a soft click. The lock slid home. In that small sound, I felt a seed of defiance. A seed that would grow. I sat on my bed, listening to the pipes groan in the walls, listening to the faint laughter drifting up from below. My hands folded in my lap, veins raised, skin thin as paper. But paper holds words, and words hold power. I still had the deed. I still had his letters. I still had myself, folks. Imagine your family telling you that you belong underground. What would you do? Walk into the dark? Or light a fire upstairs and claim your place? That night I did not sleep. Not in the basement. Not in my bed. I sat upright, heart beating steady, eyes fixed on the window where snowflakes tapped like tiny messengers. Each one whispered the same truth. I was not a guest here. I was the owner. And sooner than they thought, they would remember it. I could not close my eyes that night. Snow tapped the window soft and steady. Every sound in the house felt foreign. The creak of the stairs, the hum of the furnace, the muffled voices below. But my mind drifted backward, searching for warmth where coldness now lived. I remembered the day Mark was born. August heat pressed against the hospital walls, and I held him close, wrapped in a thin blanket. His tiny fist clutched the edge of my gown as though afraid I might let go. I whispered, "Don't worry, darling. Mama's here." Back then, I believed love was enough to shield us forever. The house itself once felt alive. In winter, we strung popcorn garlands across the living room. The smell of cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen, sticky icing melting on plates. Laughter echoed against plaster walls we painted ourselves after long days of work. The floors weren't perfect, but every creak carried our footsteps like a familiar song. My husband, Robert, worked at the plant until his back gave out. When he came home, his jacket smelled of metal and machine oil. I would wash his hands at the sink, soap and warm water chasing away the grit. He would kiss the top of my head, whispering, "One day, Helen, all this will be yours." I didn't think of deeds or papers then. I thought of love, of trust, of home. To keep us afloat, I stitched until my fingers bled. I sewed curtains for neighbors, prom dresses for high school girls, even costumes for the town parade. The old sewing machine rattled late into the night, the whir of the needle keeping rhythm with my heartbeat. I kept a jar of coins on the mantel, saving penny by penny toward Mark's school shoes. Some nights, exhaustion sat heavier than sleep, but I pressed on, because family was worth every thread. And the house, oh the house, every corner carried proof of sacrifice, the worn banister polished by Robert's steady hand. The chip cup I still used, once part of a full set we bought with our first paycheck. Even the faded tablecloth, now stained, bore the history of birthday candles and spilled cider. It all told a story, one of giving more than taking. Mark used to run through these rooms with toy cars, laughter bouncing off walls. He would crawl into my lap after school, smelling of crayons and grass. I was his anchor, his safe harbor, and now, he could not even look me in the eye when Hannah spoke her verdict. I brushed my hand over the quilt folded at the end of my bed. Every square stitched with scraps of dresses and shirts long gone. Pieces of a life lived, held together by thread. That quilt was softer than any blanket in the world, because it carried memory. It carried me through nights of loss, through Robert's illness, through grief. Now, it was the only warmth I trusted. As dawn neared, I whispered into the silence, "You promised, Robert. This place would always be mine." The words hung in the dim room, mingling with the faint scent of lavender from a sachet I'd tucked into the drawer decades ago. The scent had faded, but not the promise. Never the promise. The night pulled me deeper into memory as if the house itself whispered reminders. Every corner held a story. Every shadow carried a voice. I remembered Robert's laugh. It was never loud, but it filled the kitchen the way sunlight fills glass jars on a windowsill. He would lean back in his chair after supper, wiping his hands on a napkin, telling me, "Helen, you've built this place with your very bones." He meant the meals, the stitching, the endless nights I carried more than my share. And I'd answer, "We built it together. When the plant closed, times grew lean. Neighbors lost their homes. We tightened belts, patched clothes, stretched soup with more water than broth. Still, we stayed. Because I refused to let the bank take these walls from us. I worked double, even mended leather boots until my eyes ached, just to keep payments steady. Robert grew ill later, his back never healing, his lungs weak from years at the factory. I cared for him as he once cared for me. Warm cloths for fever, broth spooned slowly, nights awake counting the seconds between his breaths. One evening, he pressed an envelope into my hand. "Keep this safe, Helen," he said, voice rough but steady. "It's the deed. Your name is the only one on it. Never forget that." I tucked the envelope inside a blue folder, slid it behind the sewing cabinet. Back then, it felt unnecessary. Mark was young, sweet. Why would I ever need proof? Love seemed stronger than paper. But Robert knew better. He had seen greed strip dignity from men at the plant, had watched families crumble when trust met hunger. He wanted me protected, even from those closest. Snow pressed harder against the windows as I turned on my pillow. The furnace rattled below, but my chest stayed cold. That blue folder flashed in my mind. For years it sat untouched, dust gathering along its edge. Now, I wondered if Robert had seen this night coming. I thought of Mark as a boy. How he'd sit at the kitchen table, tongue poking out as he colored. How he'd tug my sleeve and whisper, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of you when I'm big." Those words once melted me. Now they cut sharper than any knife, because silence had taken their place. The house groaned in the wind. I rose and pulled the quilt around my shoulders, heavy with memory. In the hush of dawn, I walked to the sewing cabinet. My fingers traced the wood, scarred by years of needles and pins. I did not open it, not yet, but I felt the outline of what lay inside, the paper, the proof, the promise. Mark and Hannah believed I was powerless. They believed age stripped me of voice, of rights, of claim. But Robert's hand still lingered in this house. His warning still echoed. And I knew the day would come when silence ended, when proof would speak louder than betrayal. The basement might have been their sentence. But the deed was mine. I closed my eyes as the first light bled across the snow. Tomorrow would bring harsher words. But tonight reminded me of who I had been and who I still was. The next morning, Hannah's footsteps were already sharp against the kitchen floor. I followed the smell of burnt toast, stomach knotted. The air was thick with grease and yesterday's silence. She did not wait to strike. "Don't use the good plates, Helen," she said, pulling cups from the cupboard. Her tone was sugar-cut with vinegar. "Those are for people who actually contribute." Her words sliced clean like she was trimming fat. I froze, hand on the cupboard door, the chipped cup from last night still in my palm. The cup I had bought with Robert when we could barely afford one set. Mark sat at the table, phone in hand. He didn't look up, his spoon stirred coffee that no longer steamed. Silence again, his weapon of choice. I wanted to laugh. Goodness, laugh at the absurdity. I had sewn curtains for half the neighborhood, fed Mark when my own stomach was hollow, patched this house into standing. And now the good plates were off limits. My thoughts hissed like a kettle. Was sacrifice invisible once the years piled on? I placed the chipped cup gently on the counter. "Any plate holds food the same," I said, voice even. But Hannah smirked, tapping a polished fork against the counter. "Not when company comes. We don't want anyone thinking we live like you." The insult landed heavier than her first. Like me, old, worn, disposable. My chest tightened, and yet a strange humor curled at the edge of my thoughts. I wanted to say, "Then serve them on paper plates, dear, because none of this is yours." But I swallowed the words, letting them ferment into something sharper. The kitchen smelled of scorched bread. A draft slipped under the back door, brushing cold air across my ankles. The ordinary details, once comforting, now joined the betrayal. Even the house seemed to side with her, whispering, "You don't belong." Mark shifted, finally lifting his head. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe he would speak. Maybe he would say, "Enough, Hannah." Instead, he cleared his throat and muttered, "She doesn't mean it, Mom. Just don't make it harder. Don't make it harder." The words twisted deeper than Hannah's forked tongue. My son wanted peace at the cost of my dignity, peace built on my silence. I gripped the edge of the counter, wood grain pressing into my palm. The thought struck hard. Did I raise him to be spineless? Or did I teach him too well to stay quiet? Hannah slid the polished plates into the cabinet with a click, a sound final and smug. The good plates locked away, like respect itself. She turned, smiling thin, and said, "Basement's looking ready, Helen. You'll be comfortable down there eventually." The basement again, her chosen weapon. I steadied my breath, fighting the urge to slam the chipped cup across the sink. Instead, I held her gaze, letting silence sharpen between us. But silence has edges, and mine was cutting. Two-pole cliffhanger: if your family told you the good plates weren't for you, would you stay silent? Or remind them whose house it really is? The rest of the day unfolded like theater stage for my humiliation. Hannah invited a neighbor over, a woman from 2 streets down who wore perfume thick enough to drown a room. She breezed in with a laugh, and Hannah, with her perfect hostess smile, poured tea into the good china. I stood by the counter, invisible, as porcelain cups clinked and steam curled. The scent of lemon and sugar biscuits should have been sweet. Instead, it burned, because I had baked those biscuits myself just the day before. But Hannah served them as if they were hers. The neighbor's eyes flicked toward me. "Your mother-in-law lives here too." Go, her voice held polite curiosity. Before I could answer, Hannah cut in. "Oh, she stays in the basement. It's better that way." Quieter, he louder, a small, dismissive laugh, but enough to blister the air. The kind that says we know where you belong and it isn't here. My hands trembled, but I curled them into fists at my side. I wanted to shout, "This house has my name carved into its bones." Instead, I steadied my voice. "Basements aren't for people," I said softly. The neighbor blinked, unsettled. But Hannah smoothed the moment with a quick chuckle. "She's old-fashioned. Doesn't like change." That old-fashioned, that was her word for discarded. Mark appeared in the doorway then, tie loosened, eyes tired. "Everything okay here?" he asked, voice flat. The neighbor smiled, Hannah beamed, and I just stood, the chipped cup once again in my hand, my only shield. Inside, my thoughts churned with bitter irony. They could strip me of plates, of rooms, of dignity in front of strangers. But they could not strip me of memory. And memory was stronger than porcelain. Memory had deeds, letters, promises. I excused myself quietly, stepping away from their staged cheer. Upstairs, the quilt waited soft with old fabric. I pressed it to my face, breathing in lavender faded but still there. Tears came then, not loud but steady. Because memory cuts both ways, it heals and it hurts. The neighbor left eventually, her perfume trailing behind like smoke. Downstairs, I heard Hannah's laugh again, sharp and victorious. Mark said nothing. Always nothing. But silence is not surrender, it is gathering, it is planning. I walked to the sewing cabinet once more. My hand hovered near the hidden folder, the envelope Robert had pressed into my palm years ago. I did not take it out. Not yet. But I whispered to myself, one day, they'll see whose name matters here. And when that day came, no plate, no basement, no insult would ever bury me again. I woke to noise before dawn. Cabinets thudded, paper slid across wood. The house had a new sound rustling like a verdict. In the kitchen, Hannah stacked forms into neat towers. Mark set a pen on top like a gavel. Steam rose from a kettle, sharp and metallic. Tust smoked. Sign these, Hannah said. Simple updates. I pulled the first page closer. Small print swarmed like ants, utilities. Emergency contacts. Then another page, health directive. Durable something. Words braided themselves into knots. What is this? I ask. Just routine. Mark said. It helps if you can't handle things. If I can't handle things. At 72, after decades of handling everything, Hannah pushed the pen toward me. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Power of attorney. For convenience, the pen felt heavy, heavier than grief. Ink blood where my thumb pressed the barrel. My breath caught.
I'm not ready, I said.
Protects you, she said. Protects us all. Protects who? I asked. Mark sighed. Mom, please. Stop making this difficult. Difficult. I looked at his hands. Not a callus. Not a scar from mending, scrubbing, lifting. My hands held the history. His held the phone. I set the pen down. Take me to the bank? I said. Today. Hannah blinked. Why? I need to see my accounts, I said, and the deed. Silence stretched. Furnace clicked. A truck rattled past outside, throwing headlights across the wall. Hannah traded a glance with Mark. Fine, he said. After breakfast, we ate in a hush that scraped the throat. Tuss tasted of ash. Coffee went bitter fast. The chip cup warmed my palms, but not my chest. I dressed carefully. Wool skirt, sturdy shoes. The quilted coat Robert loved. Snow pecked the porch as we stepped out. Air cut like glass. The bank lobby smelled of carpet cleaner and stale paper. Fluorescent lights hummed. A coin machine clinked somewhere, counting other people's lives. I stood straighter. At the counter, a young teller smiled. Good morning. How can I help? I need statements, I said. All accounts. Last 12 months. Of course, she said. Photo ID. I slid my license across. Her nails were pink, perfect half moons. Her eyes flicked to the screen. Mark stood behind me, too close. Warm breath on my shoulder. Hannah paced, pretending patience. The printer coughed pages. The teller stacked them. Another clerk wheeled a cart of files past, wheels squeaking. Time slowed to a drip. Do you also want the signature cards? She asked. Yeah, said. And property documents on file. Her brows lifted a fraction. Give me a moment. The Mark's hand touched my elbow. Mom, this is overkill. I kept my voice low. Step back, Mark. He did not. But he went quiet. The teller returned with a man in a navy suit. He wore winter at his temples. Miss Patterson, he said. I'm the branch manager. Let's use my office. Inside, the door clicked shut. The room smelled of lemon polish. A plant drooped in one corner, leaves dusty. The manager set the stack between us like a wall. Walk me through withdrawals, I said. Monthly, large, unusual. He flipped pages. His finger stopped. Here, 3 transfers to a joint debit. Regular weekly cash pulls. New auto pays. New, I asked. Past 6 months, he said. My heartbeat moved into my throat. Whose names are on those cards? He glanced at the screen. Yours. And a secondary name? I said. He cleared his throat. Mark Patterson. The air thinned. My skin felt too tight. I pressed my palm flat on the table. Skin thin. Veins blue as rivers. They still carried iron. What about auto pays? I asked. He scanned again. Senior care plan. A premium phone line. Home supply service charges. A delivery subscription I never used. Hannah leaned forward. That's all normal. Whose phone? I asked. Mark said. Mine. Work needs it. And the gym. Silence. Cancel nothing, Hannah said quickly. It's all part of keeping her safe. Safe. I touched the signature card. My name flowed in a careful line. Beside it, marks, broad and sure. How was this added? I asked. The manager folded his fingers. Secondary access was authorized in branch. Bay me, I asked. Be the document signed here, he said, pointing. A shaky version of my name stared back. Familiar. And wrong. Date, I said. 6 months ago. I felt the room tilt. 6 months ago I had pneumonia. 6 months ago I slept in a recliner, lungs on fire. Who processed it? I asked. The manager named a teller I didn't know. Nursing home papers accompanied it, he said. Suggested eventual transition. Hannah cut in. She forgets bills. We did what was best. I let the words pass. They skittered. Small. Show me the property file, I said. He opened a drawer. Pulled a blue folder. Inside, the deeds copy gleamed under plastic. Owner read. Helen Patterson? Sole owner? Robert's promise breathed in that room. Any liens? I asked. None recorded. Mark shifted. Mom, we're wasting time. I kept my gaze on the page. I closed the folder gently. Print everything, I said. All copies. I'll pay the fees. The manager nodded. I can compile a packet. Hannah's laugh cut thin. This is ridiculous. I turned in my chair. My voice came quiet. Steel under wool. Nof. She blinked. Mark stared at the carpet. The printer churned for long minutes. Paper stacked. The manager slid rubber bands over the bundle and wrote my name on the top sheet. Do you want to adjust access? He asked. I looked at Mark's hands again. They were not a trimmer? Not a reach? Not today? I said. Today I learn. Tomorrow I act. Alone. He nodded. Understood. We left his office to the bright lobby. Light felt harsher now, even through my old coat collar. My hands warmed nothing. Coins clinked again. Life carried on, indifferent. Outside, the air slapped my face awake. Sky low and white, the kind that swallows sound. Snow squeaked under our shoes. Mark opened the car door. The packet sat heavy in my lap. In the driveway, Hannah spoke first. So happy now? I tucked the packet tight under my coat. Yes, I said. I am. She rolled her eyes. Turned toward the house. Mark lingered, keys cold in his fist. Mom, don't overreact, he said. We just tried to help. Help! I climbed the porch steps slowly. Inside, the house smelled of dust and heat. Radiators ticked like nervous teeth. I carried the packet to my room and closed the door. The quilt waited. The sewing cabinet waited. I slid the blue folder from behind it, laid both on the bed. Old promise, new proof. Downstairs, the front door opened and shut. Footsteps crossed the floor. A cupboard slammed. 2 voices murmured. I rested my palm on the folder. I felt Robert's steadiness in my bones. The furnace clicked, then held its breath. So did I, because the next move would be quiet, and it would be mine. The days shrank as if walls leaned closer. Winter pressed its weight against the siding, but the colder air lived inside. At breakfast, Hannah poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for Mark. She left the pot empty on the burner. The smell of burnt grounds drifted sharp through the kitchen, but no cup was ever slid toward me. I stirred plain oatmeal instead, its paste clinging to the spoon like punishment. Mark buried himself in the morning paper, rustling pages louder than any greeting. Hannah scrolled her phone, nails tapping the glass. I sat across from them, the chair creaking under my weight. 3 people at one table, yet silence cut deeper than knives. Later that week, they went shopping for Christmas gifts. Boots crunched on snow, car doors slammed, engine roared. I stood at the window, pressing fingers to the frosted glass, watching taillights fade down the road. No one asked if I wanted to come. The house hummed with loneliness, refrigerator clicking on and off, furnace sputtering heat that never seemed to reach me. When they returned, bags swung from their arms, bright with ribbons and red paper. I smiled, reaching to help. Don't, Mom, Hannah snapped, pulling a bag close. Some of this is fragile. Her eyes cut like broken glass. Mark avoided mine, hanging his coat without a word. I turned away slow, like carrying something heavy in my chest. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen, warm and sweet. But no plate came my way. I closed my bedroom door, the latch clicking softer than a sigh. One evening, I found my granddaughter Emily at the bottom of the stairs, clutching a stuffed bear. She looked up, freckles bright against pale cheeks. "Grandma, will you read to me?" she whispered. Her voice was a lantern in the dark. I took her hand, soft and small, and we slipped into my room. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender, a comfort from older days. I opened a storybook, words tumbling out, steady and gentle. Her head rested on my shoulder until sleep claimed her. But footsteps soon thundered in the hall. Hannah yanked open the door, eyes sharp. Emily bed. Now, Her gaze flicked to me icy. You can't spoil her every night? Emily's fingers squeezed mine before she slipped away, looking back once with eyes too old for her years. Alone again, I sat in the dim lamplight. The clock ticked loud, each second hammering the emptiness. The quilt felt heavy, not with warmth, but with the weight of being unwanted. Even the walls seemed to lean back, ashamed to witness it. Sometimes I walked the basement stairs, not to sleep there, but to remind myself what they intended. The air was damp, metallic. A faint drip echoed from an old pipe. Dust rose with every step, sticking to my throat. I stared at the concrete floor, imagining a cot, thin blanket, maybe a single bulb swinging. A prison carved inside my own house. But I never stayed. I climbed back up, each step slow, each breath sharp. And every time I thought of Robert's voice of "This house is yours." The memory kept me from breaking. But cracks spread across the days, wide enough for bitterness to seep through. Saturday morning brought the sound of laughter downstairs. Boots thumped, zippers zipped, doors slammed. Through the window, I saw scarves flashing bright red, Emily hopping toward the car with excitement. Mark helped Hannah load bags into the trunk. The driveway glittered with frost. I pulled my coat close and stepped into the hallway. "Where are you going?" I asked. Hannah turned, already tightening her scarf. "Downtown, skating rink, dinner after." "Late night?" She said it like weather, brief, indifferent. Emily looked up, cheeks glowing, mittens too big. "Grandma, can you come?" she asked. Hannah's eyes cut sharp. "Not tonight. It'll be too cold for her." Too cold for me, though I had walked winters twice as long as Hannah had lived. Mark jingled the car keys, avoiding my face. The door shut with a clap. The car backed down the drive. Tires crunched ice, fading to nothing. Silence filled the house thicker than snow. The furnace hummed. Pipes rattled. Shadows stretched across the carpet as the afternoon sank. I warmed soup from a can, metal lid scraping the counter. The smell of tomatoes clung to the air, sour sweet. I ate alone at the table, spoon clinking the bowl, each echo too loud. The house, once full of life, now felt like a hollow instrument. Later, as dusk folded in, I heard Hannah's voice through the thin wall of the living room. Sharp, fast, muffled by phone static. She forgets everything. She wanders around like a ghost. "We're carrying her." "Really?" A pause, then a dry laugh. "I swear, she'd lose the house keys if we let her." Her words burned hotter than the radiator. A ghost. Invisible except as weight. I pressed my hand against the wallpaper, cool and faintly peeling. My pulse hammered there, steady but strained. I wanted to storm in, shout, defend myself. But anger would only feed her story. Instead, I opened my sewing cabinet. Threads and faded spools rolled under my fingers. Red, navy cream. The needle gleamed in the lamplight. I stitched quietly, patching an old scarf. The rhythm of thread through fabric steadied me. Every pull reminded me I was still here, still useful, still mine. Emily returned later than bedtime, cheeks pink from cold. She tiptoed into my room, hair messy under her hat. "Grandma?" she whispered. "They had hot chocolate, but I saved you this." From her pocket, she unwrapped a napkin, handing me a cookie half broken but still sweet. I took it gently. The sugar smelled of vanilla and comfort. I brushed her hair back. "Thank you, love." She grinned, teeth small and true. Then Hannah's voice rose from the hall. "Emily?" Bed now. The girl slipped away like a shadow, leaving warmth behind her. Alone again, I broke the cookie in two. I chewed slowly, each bite a quiet rebellion. The sweetness softened the bitterness that had lodged in my chest. Night deepened. The house stilled, except for wind clawing at the windows. I lay under the quilt, the packet from the bank tucked beneath my pillow. Proof waited, silent and solid, but humiliation was coming. I felt it in the hush of the house, in the way Hannah's eyes sharpened, in Mark's sighs. Something bigger than silence was gathering, and I knew the next time it came, it would not be behind closed doors. It would be public. It would cut louder, and I would have to endure it before I could rise. The invitation came not as a request but as an order. Hannah announced it at breakfast, her tone brisk. "Dinner with the Johnsons tonight. They want to see the family. Everyone's coming. Everyone." I knew what that meant: neighbors, colleagues, and strangers curious about Hannah's curated version of our lives. I ironed my one good blouse, fabric thin at the elbows. The hiss of steam filled the room, carrying the scent of scorched cotton. Emily peeked in as I worked, her small face a flicker of light. "You look pretty." "Grandma," she whispered. I smiled, but a knot sat in my chest. The Johnsons' house glowed when we arrived. Warm lights spilling onto the snow, the smell of roasted meat drifting through the door. Coats piled high, laughter echoing from polished halls. I trailed behind as Hannah swept in, her heels sharp against the floor. Inside, voices lifted, glasses clinked. I stayed near the doorway, unsure if I was guest or burden. Mark guided Hannah forward, introducing her with practiced charm. "Emily's doing so well in school," he boasted, pride thick in his tone. Not a word about me. I sat at the far end of the long table. The wood was glossy, set with candles and silverware that gleamed. The smell of garlic bread turned my stomach with hunger. Hannah, seated near the center, glanced at me once, then turned away as though I were a piece of furniture misplaced. Halfway through the meal, the first sting came. One of the guests asked politely, "And what do you do these days, Mrs. Patterson?" Before I could open my mouth, Hannah laughed, quick and sharp. "She mostly keeps busy well, trying not to get lost in her own house." The table erupted in chuckles. Even Mark forced a smile. Heat flooded my cheeks. My fork trembled against porcelain. The meat tasted like dust in my mouth. I pressed the napkin to my lips, hiding the quiver. Another guest chimed in. "Oh, so she's retired. "Less," Hannah said smoothly, sipping wine. "We keep her comfortable. Like a pet, really?" The laughter rolled again, thick and cruel. Inside, my thoughts collided. This is my house, my table, my family. Yet I am reduced to a joke. I wanted to shout it, to slam my fist down. But I stayed still, body rigid, eyes low. Emily sat 2 seats away, her small hands clenched in her lap. She did not laugh. Her eyes burned into mine, wide with hurt. That silent solidarity kept me from breaking. As dessert was served, Hannah raised her glass. "To family," she declared. "To building something new. Together." Everyone raised their cups. I lifted mine too, though mine held only water. The candlelight reflected in the glass, trembling like my resolve. Mark leaned closer, whispering under the din, "Just let it pass, Mom. Don't make a scene." His words pierced deeper than Hannah's barbs. The boy who once swore to protect me now begged for my silence. But beneath the sting, something steadier stirred. The memory of Robert's voice, "Keep this safe. It's yours," the deed hidden away. The truth no one at this table knew. I lowered my glass, my fingers tightening against the stem. They could laugh now. But the echo of their cruelty would not last forever. The laughter had barely faded when Hannah leaned back in her chair, eyes glinting in the candlelight. She tapped her glass with a spoon. "Do you all know," she said, smiling sweetly at the table, "that Helen once tried to make soup without turning on the stove? She left the pot sitting cold, waiting for it to cook itself." A ripple of chuckles spread, low at first then louder. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. It had happened once, yes, after a sleepless night, my mind heavy. But now it was entertainment carved into a caricature. "She forgets things all the time," Hannah continued, waving her hand as if brushing away dust. "Sometimes we think she belongs in a retirement home already. Don't we, Mark?" Mark coughed into his napkin. He didn't deny it. The silence between his words said more than agreement ever could. The guests laughed harder, their voices sharp, bouncing against polished walls. My heart thudded, slow and heavy. Heat crawled up my neck, but I did not cry. I pressed my palms flat to the table, feeling the grain of the wood under my skin. Emily shifted in her chair. Her small voice cut through. "Grandma reads me stories every night. She never forgets those." The room quieted for a breath. Then Hannah's laugh cracked through brittle. "Children defend everything, don't they?" she said. The others chuckled again, awkward now, not sure where to look. I wanted to thank Emily, but I held my tongue. A child should not have to defend her grandmother. Still, her words stitched something inside me back together. Dessert plates clattered as slices of pie were served. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air, but it did not comfort. Hannah leaned closer to her neighbor, voice pitched just high enough for me to hear. "She's lucky we let her stay. Otherwise she'd be lost." The neighbor smiled thinly, nodding as though pitying me. My fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. I thought of Robert's deed tucked safe in my drawer at home. The paper with his signature, my name, the proof of ownership. They thought I was helpless. But truth sat waiting, quiet as a key in a lock. I looked around the table, at candles flickering, at polished silver, at faces that turned from me as if my shame were contagious. A strange calm settled in my chest. Let them laugh. Let them believe their story. Mine was still unwritten, and I held the pen. When the evening ended, coats were pulled from hooks, goodbyes called, doors opening to cold night air. I walked out last, the icy steps crunching beneath my shoes. The stars above looked distant, sharp pinpricks against black. I breathed in the freezing air, letting it sting. It woke me more than the humiliation had numbed me. In the car ride home, Silence stretched thick. Mark drove with eyes on the road. Hannah hummed, satisfied, as if she had won something. Emily leaned against me, small hand finding mine in the dark. Her touch was warm, anchoring. I stared out the window at streetlights flickering by. Each one felt like a countdown, not to defeat, but to a reckoning I knew was coming. They thought I was invisible, disposable, a burden to be mocked. But I was still Helen Patterson. This house, this life, this dignity, they were still mine. The night ended with quiet resolve. I went to bed not broken but sharpened. Their cruelty had drawn the line. And lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. To what about you? If the people meant to protect you laughed instead, would you endure in silence, or would you rise? Share your thoughts below. I want to know how far dignity should bend before it stands. The morning after the Johnsons' dinner, the house carried a strange quiet. Hannah clattered dishes in the kitchen, humming as though nothing had happened. Mark buried himself in the newspaper. Their laughter from last night still echoed in my ears. I carried it like a bruise no one could see. I busied myself with laundry, folding shirts stiff from the dryer. When I opened the hall closet to put them away, a folder slipped from the top shelf. It hit the floor with a heavy slap, papers spilling out like a secret demanding air. At first, I thought it was old insurance. But then I saw the bold letters X transfer of ownership. My heart clenched. The date printed was last month, and the names Mark and Hannah Patterson stood side by side in fresh ink. The room tilted. The fabric in my hands slid to the floor. I sank onto the edge of the bed, holding the papers with trembling fingers. They weren't just living here. They were preparing to erase me from my own house. Paragraphs blurred as I read. Primary residence, transfer of title, pending signatures. There, on the line where my name should have been, was a scrawl that looked eerily familiar. My signature? Or something meant to pass as it? My breath came shallow. I remembered the afternoon Hannah had shoved papers at me, claiming they were bank forms for utilities. Just sign here, Helen, nothing complicated. I'd hesitated, but her smile had been sharp, her tone too insistent. Had I signed one of these? Or had they forged it outright? The wallpaper pattern swam before my eyes. The air smelled faintly of bleach from Hannah's cleaning spree, sharp and invasive. I pressed the papers to my chest, as if hiding them inside me could protect the truth. A floorboard creaked. Emily appeared in the doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Grandma, are you okay?" Her voice was soft, laced with worry no child should carry. I forced a smile, just sorting old things, but Emily's eyes darted to the papers in my lap. She stepped closer, whispering, "They were talking last night. I heard Mommy say you'd be moving soon. She said the house will be theirs." The words stabbed deeper than the ink on the page. So it was real. Not paranoia, not exaggeration. They had plans and they weren't hiding them even from Emily's ears. I pulled her close. The rabbit squished between us. "Thank you for telling me, love," I murmured into her hair. Her scent of shampoo and sugar cookies grounded me. "You mustn't repeat it to them." "Not yet? Promise me?" She nodded, solemn as a priest. After she left, I gathered the papers into the folder, sliding them under my sweater. My pulse raced as I padded down the hallway toward my room. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the click of Hannah's shoes on tile, felt like a warning bell. In my bedroom, I locked the door and spread the papers across the quilt. There were more than I first thought. Bank statements with withdrawals I hadn't made, letters from an attorney whose name I didn't recognize, even a draft eviction notice marked template. They were building a case, brick by brick, to push me out. I sat very still, hands flat against the quilt. Tears blurred the ink, but I blinked them away. Crying would not change the lines on the page. But something else could. Robert's voice stirred again in memory of "Keep the deed safe, Helen. Don't let anyone take what's yours." I remembered where I'd hidden it. Inside the lining of his old desk drawer, wrapped in an envelope marked with his handwriting. Still untouched, still mine. The contrast struck me hard. They were plotting theft, but I still held the truth. And truth, though quiet, was heavier than all their lies. Then came a knock at the door. "Helen, are you in there?" Hannah's voice, sugary sweet, filled the hall. I scrambled, shoving papers back into the folder, sliding it beneath the mattress. My pulse hammered in my throat. "Yes, I called, forcing calm." "I'm just resting." The knob rattled once, then stilled. "Don't nap too long. We've got things to discuss later," she said, footsteps clicking away. I sat frozen, the folder pressing against the mattress beneath me like a heartbeat. Things to discuss? I knew then that their plan was further along than I wanted to admit. and the only way to survive was to move before they did. I stayed seated long after Hannah's footsteps faded, my pulse still drumming in my ears. The folder under the mattress burned like a hidden ember, hot with the weight of secrets. I pulled it out again, slower this time, laying each page flat across the quilt. The attorney's letter drew my eyes. It spoke of guardianship arrangements and competency evaluations, and they weren't just after the house. They wanted control of me, my accounts, my choices, my future. Every line dripped with quiet malice dressed up as concern. I touched the false signature again, tracing its shaky loops. It looked almost like mine, but not quite. A bad imitation of my hand, bold enough to trick anyone who didn't know better. The betrayal wasn't just practical, it was personal. Someone had tried to become me on paper. The smell of coffee drifted under the door, bitter and sharp. I imagined Hannah downstairs, pouring herself a cup with a smile, convinced her plan was airtight. My stomach twisted. How many mornings had I brewed coffee for Robert, humming softly in this very kitchen? Now the same space was used to plot my erasure. A soft knock interrupted my spiraling thoughts. It wasn't Hannah's rap this time. "Grandma, it's me," Emily whispered. I cracked the door, pulling her in quickly. Her rabbit dangled from one hand, the ears dragging across the carpet. She climbed onto the bed, eyes darting to the papers. Are they trying to take your room?" she asked, voice barely audible. I swallowed, smoothing her hair back. "Something like that, darling. But don't worry. Grandma knows what to do." Her small hand gripped mine tight. "I'll help. I can listen." The innocence in her tone broke something inside me. No child should have to guard secrets against her own parents. Yet here she was, braver than most adults. I tucked the folder deep into my nightstand drawer, locking it with the tiny brass key Robert once gave me. The sound of the lock clicking shut echoed like a vow. These papers would not disappear. And neither would I. That afternoon I moved carefully around the house, ears tuned for every careless word. Hannah spoke on the phone in the kitchen, voice low but carrying. "Yes, by spring, no, she won't resist. She's too tired. The place will be ready," though I froze behind the corner, every syllable slicing through me. She wasn't talking about family. She was talking about property. About me? Mark came in later, his voice muffled through the wall. "She'll sign if we just put it in front of her. She always does. He always does." They thought me weak, pliable, already defeated. I returned to my room, the words bouncing in my skull. The truth was unbearable, yet strangely clarifying. For months I had bent, tried to smooth conflict, swallowed insults. But now the shape of their betrayal stood clear. This was no misunderstanding. It was theft with polite faces. As night fell, I opened Robert's old desk drawer. The envelope was still there, edges yellowed, his handwriting steady and strong. Deed. My fingers brushed the paper, and relief swept over me. This was my shield. They could forge, they could plot, they could whisper about guardianship. But the law was still ink on paper, and the ink favored me. I tucked the envelope beside the locked folder. Together, they felt like armor. Not loud, not shining, but strong enough to carry me through what was coming. Emily peeked in once more before bed. "Are you safe, Grandma?" Her voice trembled. I pulled her close, heart aching. "Yes, love. Safer than they think." She smiled, trusting my words, and skipped away, clutching her rabbit. When the house finally settled into silence, I sat at the window, moonlight brushing the frost on the glass. They believed I was too tired, too blind, too broken to fight. But they had mistaken my quiet for surrender. The papers whispered a different truth. War had already begun, and I would not lose my home without drawing my own lines first. I closed the curtains, my decision set. Tomorrow, I would start moving pieces they didn't even know existed. The house slept, but my mind would not. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, where faint cracks spread like spiderwebs across plaster. The tick of the clock on my nightstand grew louder with each second, a metronome for the storm inside my chest. I closed my eyes, but the images came anyway. Hannah's smirk at the Johnsons' dinner. Mark's silence, heavier than betrayal. The forged signature that mocked me from the papers. Each memory pressed down like a weight on my ribs, making it hard to breathe. The furnace rumbled once, spitting lukewarm air through the vents. But the room felt cold, my quilt heavy with more than fabric. I slipped out of bed, bare feet pressing against the chill of hardwood. The boards creaked, reminding me that even the house groaned beneath neglect. I padded toward the desk where Robert's envelope and the folder of proof waited. I touched them both, fingertips brushing paper edges. The smell of old wood and dust rose up, mingling with lavender from the sachet Emily had tucked in my drawer last Christmas. Her small kindness burned brighter than the furnace. She was the one flicker that kept me from crumbling completely. I whispered to the dark, "What would you do, Robert?" His voice answered in memory, steady and firm. "Don't give them what's already yours. Stand tall, Helen." The words stirred tears, hot and unrelenting. I pressed a sleeve against my face, angry at the wetness. Why should I cry for people who plotted my erasure? Why waste salt water on their cruelty? But grief is a stubborn guest. It lingers even when you bolt the door. I sat at the window, moonlight silvering the frost outside. Snow glittered across the yard, unbroken, quiet, faithful. I used to watch Robert shovel it in long, straight lines, his breath puffing white in the air. Now only tire tracks marred the surface. Mark's car, Hannah's sous vide, symbols of their presence where respect should have been. The clock struck 2. Still I sat, knees drawn to my chest, listening to the house breathe. Every creak felt amplified, every shadow more menacing. Sleep was a stranger. Resolve, however, was beginning to visit. I thought of the papers in the folders. Forged forms, bank withdrawals, attorney letters. Evidence of theft hidden in plain sight. And I thought of the deeds still signed in my name. Their arrogance was their weakness. They believed me too frail to notice, too weak to resist. They forgot that quiet does not equal powerless. I traced the window pane with one finger, feeling the icy condensation. My reflection looked back at me, lined, tired, but unbroken. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I recognized the woman staring back. Not the burden they painted me as, but the keeper of the keys. Behind my door I heard soft padding feet. "Emily." She peeked in, hair tousled, rabbit dragging along the floor. "Grandma, you're awake." Her voice was drowsy, but her eyes were clear. "Yes, love. Just thinking." She climbed into my lap, curling against me like she had when she was younger. "I had a bad dream. But you feel warm." Her trust cut through the darkness, grounding me again. I held her close until her breathing steadied. When she finally slipped back to bed, I sat straighter, heart steadier. If I gave in, they would win. If I folded, she would learn the wrong lesson. That silence meant surrender. No, silence would be my disguise. But action, quiet, deliberate, would be my answer. The clock ticked on. I had lost the night. But I had gained something better than sleep, resolve. By the time dawn pressed pale gray light against my curtains, my body felt heavy, but my mind stood sharper than it had in years. I had lost the night to restless pacing and endless memory, but somewhere in the darkness a plan had begun to breathe. I sat at the kitchen table, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of pipes. The smell of yesterday's coffee grounds lingered, bitter and stale. I wrapped both hands around a chipped mug, though it held nothing but air, and let the weight anchor me. My eyes drifted to the photographs still pinned on the wall. Robert in his work jacket, grinning beside the porch he built plank by plank. Mark as a boy, clutching a baseball glove too big for his hand. And me, 40 years younger, tired but smiling, holding a tray of pies after a Thanksgiving that nearly broke my back. I had been the glue then, holding everything together while others reaped the comfort. And still I stood. The memory made my lips curl into a wry smile. If I could survive nights of double shifts at the diner, winters when the furnace sputtered out, and summers when the garden yielded little more than weeds, I could survive this. Betrayal was cruel, but it was not stronger than me. I pulled the folder closer again, smoothing the wrinkled pages across the table. Each document was an insult, but also a weapon. Hannah and Mark had underestimated me. They assumed these papers would vanish in shadows. They forgot I had lived my whole life in plain sight, watching, enduring, remembering. Observation was its own kind of power. I made notes on a pad of lined paper, the scratch of my pen steady. Step 1, confirm the deed. Step 2, lock accounts. Step 3, gather evidence quietly. The word steadied me, transformed chaos into sequence. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was protection, the kind Robert would have demanded. My stomach rumbled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since last evening's farce of a dinner. I opened the bread box, inhaling the faint yeasty scent of the last loaf. The knife scraped against the cutting board as I sliced 2 thin pieces. The sound was grounding, ordinary life carrying on, even as battles brewed beneath the surface. Through the window, snow lay across the yard in a clean sheet, broken only by faint animal tracks. I traced them with my eyes, following the meandering path. Survival leaves marks, I thought, and so would I. Upstairs, footsteps stirred. Emily's soft thud, followed by the heavier tread of Mark. I tucked the folder back into its hiding place, heart rate steady. I had no need to confront them yet. My strength lay in patience, in letting them believe their narrative while mine unfolded unseen. Hannah's laughter floated down the staircase, sharp even in morning light. "She won't last another month here," she said to Mark. "I'll handle it." Their voices carried without shame, confident I was too deaf, too dulled to hear. I let the words wash over me, no longer cutting as deep. Knowledge had shifted the balance. Their cruelty no longer defined me. It only confirmed what I already knew: they had declared war, and wars are not won by shouting. They are won by endurance, by timing, by choosing when to reveal the hand you've kept hidden. I finished my dry toast, brushed the crumbs into the sink, and straightened. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders squared naturally, no effort needed. The house might be filled with plots, but it was still mine. And tomorrow, the first step of my counterstroke would begin. I knew exactly where I needed to go, and I knew exactly what proof I had to carry with me. I left the house just after dawn, the cold Ohio air biting at my cheeks. The snow crunched under my boots, each step a small rebellion against the silence Hannah and Mark thought I lived in. They believed I had nowhere to go, nothing to fight with. But in my coat pocket, folded neatly, lay Robert's envelope. The deed, the anchor. The bank sat at the corner of Main and Elm, its glass doors fogged from the blast of heat inside. The smell of disinfectant and fresh ink hit me as soon as I stepped in. A young teller greeted me with practiced cheer. "Good morning." "Ma'am, how can I help you today?" Her eyes slid past me quickly, already searching for the next customer. Folks don't see old women as much more than a delay in their day. "I need to speak with the branch manager," I said, my voice steady. She blinked, then nodded, motioning me toward a leather chair near the offices. I sat, clutching my purse, listening to the faint whir of printers and the metallic shuffle of coins, counting behind the glass. When the manager appeared, a man in his 40s with a too-tight tee, I stood tall. "I'd like to confirm the ownership of my property," I said, sliding the envelope across his desk once we were alone. He examined the deed, then pulled up files on his computer. "Mrs. Patterson, your name is the only one listed here. No joint ownership, no secondary claims." The words spread warmth through my chest. "Still mine?" "Always mine." I leaned closer. "I also need to remove all shared access to my accounts immediately." He hesitated. "Of course, but are you certain?" "These changes are significant." "I am certain." The firmness in my tone surprised even me. He nodded, clicking through screens, the rhythmic tapping of keys like a drumbeat of reclamation. When the paperwork was done, he slid copies across to me. The weight of those pages in my hands was heavier than steel. I thanked him, tucking them into my purse with Robert's deed. As I walked back out into the cold, the air felt cleaner somehow. The wind stung, but it carried freedom. At home, I moved carefully, slipping the papers into the lining of my coat before hanging it by the door. Hannah and Mark were at the table, Hannah stirring sugar into her coffee. "Out so early?" she asked, a practiced smile stretching too wide. "Just needed some air," I replied, settling into my chair. My tone was casual. "The way you talk when nothing at all has changed." That was the key. Let them think the ground still held steady under their feet, even as I quietly shifted the earth beneath them. Emily glanced up from her cereal, eyes meeting mine. She tilted her head slightly, as if asking a question without words. I gave her the smallest nod, and her lips curved into a secret smile. She knew, somehow, that I hadn't gone out just for air. The day passed with the usual routines: laundry, dishes, Hannah's clipped instructions for what she wanted done before dinner. I obeyed, folding towels and setting plates, my hands calm, my face blank. But inside, the tide had already turned. They could demand obedience all they wanted. It no longer cost me anything to give the appearance of it, because behind the mask, I had taken the first step back into my own life. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a law office downtown. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet, a blend of clean and wary. Rain tapped against the window, soft but steady, as if even the sky knew I needed cover for my errand. The receptionist, a woman with neat glasses and kind eyes, offered me a clipboard. "Fill these out, and Mr. Garrison will see you shortly." I nodded, writing my name slowly, savoring each loop of the pen. Every letter reminded me I still existed. When the lawyer entered, I stood. He was older than I expected, with silver hair and a calm, deliberate way of speaking. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Let's see how I can help." I slid the folder across the desk. Inside lay the deed, the forged papers, and the bank documents confirming what I had done. He examined each page, his brows knitting tighter. "This is serious?" he said finally. They've been preparing to cut you out completely. I know, I whispered. But they underestimated me. He looked at me with a mix of respect and caution. You've taken smart steps. Securing the deed, removing their access. That's solid. The next move is legal reinforcement. We can file a notice of protection, essentially locking down any future claims they might try. I nodded, my heartbeat quickening. And it can be quiet? His smile was thin. As quiet as you need? He explained the process, his words steady, while I scribbled notes in my pad. Each line felt like another brick in the wall I was building between myself and their betrayal. When the meeting ended, I shook his hand again. It was not a gesture of dependence, but of alliance. Back home, I tucked the lawyer's card into the seam of my purse. Dinner simmered on the stove. Chicken Hannah had tossed in a pan before leaving the kitchen to me. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the air, comforting yet sharp. I stirred slowly, controlling my breathing, reminding myself not to let triumph show. Mark wandered in, loosening his tie. Mom, did you pay the utility bill? Hannah said the notice came. I wiped my hands on a towel. I'll check, I said mildly, masking the fire in my chest. I had paid more bills in my life than he had ever even opened. But I let the words slide past, obedience as camouflage. That night, Emily slipped into my room again. She sat on the edge of my bed, whispering, "You're not as sad as before." Her eyes shone, a child's instinct sharper than any adult's. "No, love," I told her softly. "I'm not sad. I'm awake." She smiled, curling up beside me until sleep claimed her. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, but this time the ticking clock sounded like a friend. Every second carried me closer to justice. The house still looked the same. The routine still played out with their usual cruelty, but I no longer felt caged. I was planning, I was moving, and they didn't even know the ground had begun to shift. It struck me then, justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, steady and sure, until the right moment came to strike. I would wait for that moment. I would be ready. Tell me if you were in my place. Would you stay silent and endure, or would you fight back quietly, one step at a time? The morning of my quiet reckoning arrived with brittle sunlight. Snow on the porch glittered like shards of glass, sharp and cold. I stood at the window, wrapping my robe tighter, my breath fogging faintly against the pane. Today would not be ordinary. On the kitchen table lay a neat stack of papers inside a plain folder. Bank confirmations, the deed Robert had signed decades ago, and the legal protections Mr. Garrison had filed on my behalf. The folder looked small, almost harmless, yet it carried the weight of my life. Each page was a boundary restored, a defense rebuilt, a voice reclaimed. I brewed coffee, the smell strong and earthy, filling the air with a comfort my nerves needed. My hands shook only slightly as I poured it into my favorite chipped mug. The same mug Robert had used every morning, back when his laugh filled these rooms. I let the warmth of it steady me, reminding me I was not alone in spirit. By 9, Hannah was already barking orders from the hallway. "Mark, don't forget to check with the realtor again. We need her signature sooner rather than later." Her tone was sharp, clipped, as if I were a piece of stubborn furniture to be maneuvered out of the way. I pressed my lips together, letting the bitterness pass through me without sticking. Soon her words would lose their bite. Mark appeared in the kitchen, loosening his tie as he reached for toast. "Mom, the lawyer's coming over this afternoon. Just a few papers we'll need you to sign, nothing major." He said it casually, like he was asking me to pass the salt, but his eyes darted away too quickly. He knew. He feared resistance, and he was right to. I smiled faintly, sipping my coffee. "Right," I said. The calmness in my voice made him blink. I had always folded under pressure, always sought peace by yielding. Not today. The day stretched long, each chore a quiet drumbeat toward the inevitable. I folded laundry, the fabric warm from the dryer, the scent of lavender softener clinging to the air. I stirred soup for Emily, humming low as the pot simmered. Outwardly, I was the same compliant figure. Inside, my spine was steel. At noon, I slipped upstairs, closing my bedroom door with care. I pulled the folder from beneath the quilt, running my fingers across its cover. This was no weapon of violence, no scream of rage. It was truth, signed and stamped, undeniable. And it was mine. A clock ticked on the nightstand, each second louder than the last. The rhythm carried me back to nights of waiting tables, listening for the bell of an order ready. Back then, I survived by rushing to serve. Now I would survive by refusing to bend. By 3, the lawyer they had arranged to bring arrived. I heard Hannah's laugh at the door, brittle and triumphant. The sound of footsteps followed, shoes clacking against the hardwood, drawing nearer. I placed the folder gently on the bedspread, smoothing the edges flat. My heartbeat slowed, steady and strong. For once, I would not be the one caught off guard. I would be the storm waiting in the stillness. And when the door opened, they would learn just how much of this house, and of myself, I still owned. The lawyer they brought with them carried a briefcase that snapped open like a warning. He sat at the dining room table, clearing his throat as though this were already settled. Hannah hovered behind him, arms crossed, her eyes glittering with triumph. Mark shifted uneasily, glancing from me to the folder in the man's hands. "Mrs. Patterson," the lawyer began smoothly, "we have a few documents requiring your signature. This will help streamline the transfer of ownership so your son can manage things more efficiently." Purely administrative. His tone dripped with rehearsed patience, the kind reserved for the supposedly feeble. Hannah's voice cut in, sharp as broken glass. "It's for your own good, Helen. You can't handle this place anymore." Her words tried to slice, but I only sipped from my mug, the coffee now lukewarm yet grounding. "Go ahead," I said calmly. "Show me what you've prepared." The lawyer slid the first set of papers across the table. The pages rustled, heavy with intent. I read the lines slowly, each sentence an insult written in legal jargon. They wanted me erased from my own deed. They wanted control of the accounts Robert and I had built together. I looked up, meeting Hannah's stare, letting silence stretch until her smugness faltered. "These are forgery," I said evenly. Her lips twitched. "Excuse me?" "They're not mine," I continued. "My husband never signed away this house, and neither have I." Mark coughed, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed another sheet toward me. "Mom, this is just paperwork. Don't make it difficult." "Difficult," I repeated softly. The word tasted bitter and sweet at once. I reached under my chair and drew out my folder. The thump it made on the table silenced the room. I opened it slowly, deliberately, like unveiling a hidden blade. "Here," I said, sliding the first document across. The bank manager's signature, confirming sole ownership in my name. Next, the deed Robert signed. Sealed, dated long before Hannah entered our lives. Finally, the protective filings from Mr. Garrison, notarized and final. The other lawyer's brows furrowed. He lifted the documents, scanning line by line, his composure cracking. "These," he muttered. "These appear in order." "Quite in order." Hannah's voice rose, shrill and desperate. "This is nonsense." "She doesn't understand. She's old, confused." Her words stumbled, faltering against the cold certainty of ink and seal. Mark rubbed his temples, the flush creeping up his neck. "Mum, when did you do this?" "While you thought I was folding laundry," I said, my tone gentle but unyielding. "While you thought I was invisible." That the clock on the wall ticked louder, each beat punctuating the silence that followed. Emily peeked in from the hallway, her small face tense, sensing the storm in the room. I caught her gaze and gave the faintest nod. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. The lawyer cleared his throat again, uneasy now. "I cannot advise my clients to proceed further with these documents. They hold no standing." Hannah's face drained of color, fury sparking in her eyes. Mark slumped back in his chair, the reality sinking in. But this was only the beginning. I had shown them the truth, yes. But the full weight of what they had lost was still waiting to fall, and when it did, it would leave them gasping. The morning of my quiet reckoning arrived with brittle sunlight. Snow on the porch glittered like shards of glass, sharp and cold. I stood at the window, wrapping my robe tighter, my breath fogging faintly against the pane. Today would not be ordinary. On the kitchen table lay a neat stack of papers inside a plain folder. Bank confirmations, the deed Robert had signed decades ago, and the legal protections Mr. Garrison had filed on my behalf. The folder looked small, almost harmless, yet it carried the weight of my life. Each page was a boundary restored, a defense rebuilt, a voice reclaimed. I brewed coffee, the smell strong and earthy, filling the air with a comfort my nerves needed. My hands shook only slightly as I poured it into my favorite chipped mug, the same mug Robert had used every morning, back when his laugh filled these rooms. I let the warmth of it steady me, reminding me I was not alone in spirit. By 9, Hannah was already barking orders from the hallway. "Mark, don't forget to check with the realtor again. We need her signature sooner rather than later." Her tone was sharp, clipped, as if I were a piece of stubborn furniture to be maneuvered out of the way. I pressed my lips together, letting the bitterness pass through me without sticking. Soon, her words would lose their bite. Mark appeared in the kitchen, loosening his tie as he reached for toast. "Mom, the lawyer's coming over this afternoon. Just a few papers we'll need you to sign, nothing major." He said it casually like he was asking me to pass the salt. But his eyes darted away too quickly. He knew. He feared resistance. And he was right to. I smiled faintly, sipping my coffee. "All right," I said. The calmness in my voice made him blink. I had always folded under pressure, always sought peace by yielding. Not today. The day stretched long, each tore a quiet drumbeat toward the inevitable. I folded laundry, the fabric warm from the dryer, the scent of lavender softener clinging to the air. I stirred soup for Emily, humming low as the pot simmered. Outwardly, I was the same compliant figure. Inside, my spine was steel. At noon, I slipped upstairs, closing my bedroom door with care. I pulled the folder from beneath the quilt, running my fingers across its cover. This was no weapon of violence, no scream of rage. It was truth, signed and stamped, undeniable. And it was mine. A clock ticked on the nightstand, each second louder than the last. The rhythm carried me back to nights of waiting tables, listening for the bell of an order ready. Back then, I survived by rushing to serve. Now I would survive by refusing to bend. By 3, the lawyer they had arranged to bring arrived. I heard Hannah's laugh at the door, brittle and triumphant. The sound of footsteps followed, shoes clacking against the hardwood, drawing nearer. I placed the folder gently on the bedspread, smoothing the edges flat. My heartbeat slowed, steady and strong. For once, I would not be the one caught off guard. I would be the storm waiting in the stillness. And when the door opened, they would learn just how much of this house, and of myself, I still owned. The lawyer they brought with them carried a briefcase that snapped open like a warning. He sat at the dining room table, clearing his throat as though this were already settled. Hannah hovered behind him, arms crossed, her eyes glittering with triumph. Mark shifted uneasily, glancing from me to the folder in the man's hands. "Mrs. Patterson," the lawyer began smoothly, "we have a few documents requiring your signature. This will help streamline the transfer of ownership so your son can manage things more efficiently." Purely administrative. His tone dripped with rehearsed patience, the kind reserved for the supposedly feeble. Hannah's voice cut in, sharp as broken glass. "It's for your own good, Helen. You can't handle this place anymore." Her words tried to slice, but I only sipped from my mug, the coffee now lukewarm yet grounding. "Go ahead," I said calmly. "Show me what you've prepared." The lawyer slid the first set of papers across the table. The pages rustled, heavy with intent. I read the lines slowly, each sentence an insult written in legal jargon. They wanted me erased from my own deed. They wanted control of the accounts Robert and I had built together. I looked up, meeting Hannah's stare, letting silence stretch until her smugness faltered. "These are forgery," I said evenly. Her lips twitched. "Excuse me?" "They're not mine," I continued. "My husband never signed away this house, and neither have I." Mark coughed, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed another sheet toward me. "Mom, this is just paperwork. Don't make it difficult." "Difficult," I repeated softly. The word tasted bitter and sweet at once. I reached under my chair and drew out my folder. The thump it made on the table silenced the room. I opened it slowly, deliberately, like unveiling a hidden blade. "Here," I said, sliding the first document across. The bank manager's signature confirming sole ownership in my name. Next, the deed Robert signed, sealed, dated long before Hannah entered our lives. Finally, the protective filings from Mr. Garrison, notarized and final. The other lawyer's brows furrowed. He lifted the documents, scanning line by line, his composure cracking. "These," he muttered. "These appear in order." "Quite in order?" Hannah's voice rose, shrill and desperate. "This is nonsense?" "She doesn't understand. She's old, confused." Her words stumbled, faltering against the cold certainty of ink and seal. Mark rubbed his temples, the flush creeping up his neck. "Mom, when did you do this?" "While you thought I was folding laundry?" I said, my tone gentle but unyielding. "While you thought I was invisible." The clock on the wall ticked louder, each beat punctuating the silence that followed. Emily peeked in from the hallway, her small face tense, sensing the storm in the room. I caught her gaze and gave the faintest nod. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. The lawyer cleared his throat again, uneasy now. "Cannot advise my clients to proceed further with these documents. They hold no standing." Hannah's face drained of color, fury sparking in her eyes. Mark slumped back in his chair, the reality sinking in. But this was only the beginning. I had shown them the truth, yes, but the full weight of what they had lost was still waiting to fall. And when it did, it would leave them gasping. I leaned back in my chair, the folder now closed, the silence in the room cutting deeper than any word. Hannah's breath came in quick, shallow bursts, her fists clenching at her sides. Mark avoided my eyes, staring down at the table as though answers might rise from the wood grain. "You planned this?" Hannah hissed finally. "Behind our backs?" Her outrage dripped like venom, but underneath it I heard the tremor of fear. "No," I said quietly. I protected myself. Something you never thought I'd remember how to do? I rose from my seat, the chair scraping softly against the floor. My hand brushed the papers once more, ensuring they remained visible, undeniable. "This house is mine. This account is mine. And from today forward you have no power here." Mark tried again, his voice almost pleading now. "Mom, think about Emily. We just wanted to make sure. Don't you dare use her as your excuse." I cut in sharp enough to slice the air. "She is the only light in this place, and you both tried to poison it." The lawyer closed his briefcase with an awkward snap. "I'll take my leave," he muttered, clearly eager to escape the tension crackling in the room. His footsteps faded quickly down the hall, the door shutting behind him with a hollow thud. Silence settled again, thicker than before. Hannah's eyes darted to Mark, then back to me, searching for some leverage left to wield. But the cupboard was bare. I had stripped them of every weapon they thought they had. I reached into my purse and withdrew one final envelope. I placed it on the table between us. "This," I said, "is the revocation of any authority you had over my accounts or property. Effective immediately." Mark's face paled as he recognized the signatures. Hannah's lips parted in shock, no words finding purchase. I stepped back, lifting my chin. "You tried to bury me in the basement. You tried to erase me from my own home. But the truth doesn't bend just because you want it to. And today, the truth is standing." The clock struck the hour, the chime echoing like a gavel. For the first time in months, I felt air fill my lungs without weight pressing down.
"I wasn't finished. Not yet."
But justice had begun to speak. The storm broke not with shouting but with silence. After the lawyer left, the house sagged into stillness, as if even the walls exhaled relief. The tension that had stretched so tight finally loosened, leaving an echo that felt strange against my skin. For the first time in months, I was not bracing myself for Hannah's next jab, or Mark's quiet betrayal. Hannah paced the kitchen like a caged thing, her shoes tapping against the tile in sharp bursts. Mark sat slumped in a chair, rubbing his forehead as though he could press away the truth. The folder still rested on the table, my documents stacked neatly undeniable. Every glance Hannah cast toward it was a dagger dulled by fear. "You can't mean to throw us out?" She snapped suddenly, her voice pitched higher than usual. "You can't after everything." I lifted my mug, letting the bitter coffee coat my tongue. "I haven't thrown anyone out," I said softly. "I only reminded you of where the lines are." Mark's shoulders sagged further, his gaze fixed on the floor. He didn't defend her this time. The weight of his silence pressed heavier than any word. I watched him and thought of the little boy who once clung to my hand at the county fair, sticky with cotton candy, eyes wide at the Ferris wheel. How far he had drifted, how much it hurt to know the distance might never close. Emily crept closer, small footsteps hesitant on the wood. She reached my side and slipped her hand into mine. Her palm was warm, steadying. "Grandma?" she whispered. "Can I stay with you tonight?" Her eyes flicked toward her parents, wary, but her grip tightened. I smiled gently, smoothing her hair back. "Of course, dear. This is your home, too." The words landed in the room like a bell toll. Hannah spun, fury in her face. "She's manipulating you, Mark. Can't you see? She's trying to turn Emily against us." Mark only sighed, covering his eyes with his palm. "She didn't make those documents up, Hannah. We pushed too far." His voice was low, frayed, and something inside me ached at the exhaustion in it. But pity was not enough to undo what they had tried to do. They had hoped to strip me of everything, and now they were the ones empty-handed. Dinner that night was quiet. Hannah barely touched her plate, stabbing at the vegetables with unnecessary force. Mark ate without tasting, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the table. Emily sat between us, leaning slightly toward me, her small frame radiating a loyalty I hadn't expected but deeply cherished. I chewed slowly, savoring the taste of food I had cooked without fear of criticism. Even the simplest soup carried flavor again. Afterward, Hannah vanished into the guest room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Mark retreated upstairs without a word. Only Emily lingered, helping me stack dishes, her small arms straining to reach the sink.
Grandma?
She whispered, "Are they going to leave?" I paused, the dish towel damp in my hand. "Maybe," I admitted, "and maybe that's what's best for now." See, she nodded solemnly, as if the thought sat heavy but true in her young chest. Then she smiled faintly. "At least you'll still be here." How the words carried more weight than she knew. Yes, I would still be here. And for the first time, I felt certain of it. Morning light crept through the curtains the next day, softer than before. I brewed coffee again, the aroma filling the air like a quiet hymn. When I stepped onto the porch, the snow had begun to melt, rivulets of water tracing down the steps. It felt like the house itself was thawing, shedding the frost that had clung too long. Hannah emerged mid-morning, a suitcase in her grip, her jaw tight. She didn't meet my eyes. Mark followed, carrying another bag, his expression carved in shame. They didn't announce it, didn't stage a farewell. They simply moved, silent as shadows. I stood in the doorway, Emily at my side. The cold air brushed my face, tinged with the smell of wet earth. Mark glanced back once, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again. He turned and loaded the trunk. Hannah slammed the car door. The engine roared, tires crunching over ice, and then they were gone. The driveway lay empty, the silence vast. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders easing as though I had carried their weight too long. Emily leaned against me. "Grandma, are we safe now?" I bent down, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Yes, darling," I murmured. "We are safe."
At last.
Inside, the house seemed to breathe easier. The walls no longer echoed with harsh words. The rooms no longer held the constant thrum of tension. It was just us, just the sound of a kettle whistling, the creak of the floorboards, the warmth of the fire. Peace, fragile but real. I sat by the window, watching the sun struggle through winter clouds. My reflection in the glass looked older, lined, wary. But behind the wariness, there was steel. I had not just survived, I had reclaimed. And tomorrow, I would decide what to build from the pieces they left behind. The house felt different in their absence. Not empty, no, not hollow, but open, breathing again. Each step I took down the hallway no longer echoed with dread. The floorboards groaned like old friends rather than judges of my worth. For the first time in years, silence was a comfort. I descended into the basement one morning, the same place Hannah once tried to banish me. The air still smelled faintly of cement and dust, the boxes stacked like tombstones of forgotten seasons. Yet standing there, I felt no sting of shame. Instead, I saw possibility. I opened the curtains on the small window, letting light pour in. Dust motes spun like tiny dancers. I carried down fabric from the attic. Bolts I had saved from Robert's shop days, cottons and wools still smelling faintly of cedar. The hum of my old sewing machine soon filled the room, steady as a heartbeat. What once was a dungeon became a studio. What once held insult now held creation. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, watching me cut cloth. Her eyes followed every movement, her fingers brushing scraps like they were treasures. "Grandma," she asked, "can I help?" I smiled, handing her a pair of small scissors. "Cut along this line, dear. Straight as you can." She leaned close, tongue between her teeth, determination written across her young face. Together, we stitched and shaped. A quilt first, then a dress for her doll. Her laughter filled the basement, dissolving every trace of cruelty that had ever clung to those walls. Each snip of thread was a declaration. This space belongs to us now. At night, when Emily slept upstairs, I lingered by the machine. The wear soothed me, the smell of cotton grounding me in something honest. Robert's voice seemed to echo in the rhythm. "This house is yours. Don't let anyone take it." I whispered back into the quiet. I didn't. One evening, Emily patted down barefoot in her pajamas, clutching the doll I'd dressed. She climbed into my lap and whispered, "It's warm here." I kissed the crown of her head, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, light and sweet.
"Yes," I said softly.
"Warm in ours." I thought of the road Hannah and Mark had taken, of the anger that drove them out. Once, the thought might have hollowed me. But now, sitting with Emily in the glow of a lamp, I felt only release. Some losses carve you open so something better can grow. And here, in the hum of needles and the laughter of a child, I found what was growing: not revenge, not bitterness, but legacy stitched in every seam. Spring crept slowly into Ohio, the snow receding to reveal patches of green. The air carried the damp smell of thawed soil, and the house seemed to lean into the season with me. Each open window pulled in birdsong. Each breeze reminded me that endings often carry beginnings in their folds. I began inviting neighbors over once a week. Old friends, widows. women who had sat quietly through their own storms. We gathered in the basement, my reclaimed space, where the sewing machine hummed and scraps of fabric became quilts for shelters, baby blankets for hospitals, dresses for children who had little. The air was full of thread, cinnamon tea, and the soft sound of women speaking truths they hadn't dared share before. Emily became our youngest apprentice, darting between chairs, her laughter the brightest music. She carried spools of thread like they were ribbons of gold, and her stitches grew straighter each week. When she showed me her first finished patch, her smile stretched wide.
See, Grandma? I did it by myself.
I pulled her close, my heart swelling. Yes, dear, you did, and that's only the beginning. The basement was no longer shadow and insult. It was light labor and legacy. The very place that was meant to diminish me had become the workshop of my renewal. Every quilt, every dress, every laugh stitched into its walls reminded me that dignity is not something given. It is something reclaimed and then passed forward. Sometimes I still thought of Mark, of the boy who once held my hand, of the man who lost his way. Grief lingered, soft but persistent, but bitterness no longer ruled it. I prayed he might one day see what he had traded away. For now, I let peace be enough? Emily often asked. Grandma, will this all be mine one day? I smiled, smoothing her hair. The house, maybe. But more than that, the knowing. Knowing that no one gets to decide your worth but you. That's the inheritance I want to leave you. Her eyes lit, as if she understood more than her years allowed. She held my hand with a certainty that steadied me. Yes, she would carry it forward. Not just the house, not just the fabric, but the story of standing tall when others try to cut you down. One evening, as the sun bled orange through the windows, I stepped onto the porch with Emily beside me. The fields stretched quiet, the sky vast. I inhaled deeply, the scent of lilacs drifting from the edge of the yard. I felt Robert there, not in sorrow but in pride. I had kept the promise. The house was safe, my spirit intact, and as Emily leaned against my arm, the world felt wide again. Not a cage, not a battle, but an open road. A place where dignity and love could outlast betrayal. A place where my story, stitched with scars and courage, became hers to carry forward. I once thought the cruelest thing in this world was being made invisible, treated as if my years, my sacrifices, and my love meant nothing. But I know better now. The cruelest thing would have been believing them. Believing I was a burden, a shadow, a woman whose story had ended. Instead, I chose to stand quietly, firmly, without shouting or spectacle. I held the keys that were mine all along. And when I turned them in the lock, I opened more than doors. I opened the truth of who I was. This house still carries my husband's laughter in its beams, my son's childhood footsteps in its stairs, and now my granddaughter's bright future in its walls. It holds the past, yes, but more importantly, it holds tomorrow. I am not just a woman who survived betrayal. I am a woman who built something stronger out of it. A home that cannot be taken. A dignity that cannot be erased. A legacy stitched in thread, memory and love. And as long as Emily walks beside me, carrying the lessons of my scars, I know my story has only just begun.